Tensions are heating up in the South China Sea as China firmly pushes back against the Philippines' latest move. The Philippines recently staked a bold claim to an extended continental shelf in the West Philippine Sea, presenting it to the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. But on June 18, China fired back with a formal protest. In a strongly worded note verbal addressed to UN Secretary-General António Guterres,
the Philippines' move infringes on China's sovereign rights and jurisdiction. While there is international law, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and contravenes the relevant provisions of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, based on the rules of procedure of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. If the submission made by the Philippine side involves disputed waters, the Commission shall not consider in determining the submission.
China's message is clear. They won't stand by quietly as their territorial boundaries are challenged. The unfolding drama raises the stakes in an already volatile region, leaving the international community watching closely to see what happens next. On June 14, the Philippines officially submitted its claim to the UN, seeking recognition of an extended continental shelf in the West Philippine Sea, stretching up to 350 nautical miles from Palawan's baseline. Invoking Article 76 of the 1982 UN Convention, the Philippines asserted its right to exploit the resources of this vast seabed, which extends up to 648 kilometers. This includes exclusive rights to authorize and regulate any drilling activities. In the latest twist in the South China Sea saga, China has strongly rejected the Philippines' claim to a 200 nautical mile extended continental shelf in the West Palawan region. According to China, the Philippines' move is not only unfounded but also a serious infringement on China's sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction in the disputed waters of the South China Sea. China argues that it holds indisputable sovereignty over what it calls Nanhai Zhudo, a term that encompasses 4 major island chains in the South China Sea, including the Spratly Islands. These islands, located to the west of Palawan, are at the center of the Philippines' recent claim for an extended continental shelf. China's stance is clear. They believe they have full authority over these waters, which include not just the islands themselves but also the surrounding seabed and subsoil. This conflict highlights the complex and contentious nature of territorial claims in one of the world's most strategically significant maritime regions. As the dispute unfolds, both nations and international observers are closely watching the developments, knowing that this claim could reshape the balance of power in the South China Sea. The 2016 arbitral ruling by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, invalidates China's 9 claims and declared its activities in the area unlawful. The Philippines sought UN recognition of the extended continental margin, citing geological and tectonic data on the Palawan-Mindoro continent and the West Palawan region. The Philippines provided data showing that the West Palawan region is a natural prolongation of the land territory of the Philippines, extending beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines. Thus, the Philippines is entitled to a continental shelf beyond 200 miles in the West Palawan region, according to the 30-page executive summary of its June 14 partial submission to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. According to UNCLOS, a country's continental shelf comprises the seabed and subsoil of the submarine areas that extend beyond its territorial sea throughout the natural prolongation of its land territory to the outer edge of the continental margin or to a distance of 200 nautical miles from the baselines. But the outer edge of the continental shelf should not exceed 350 nautical miles from the baseline. The Philippines has asked the United Nations body to formally recognize the extent of its undersea continental seabed in the West Philippine Sea, where it would have the exclusive right to exploit resources, the Department of Foreign Affairs said in a move that rejects China's vast territorial claims to the region. The Philippine government, through the Philippine mission to the UN in New York, submitted information to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf on the extent of its undersea shelf in the South China Sea off western Palawan province after more than a decade and a half of scientific research. The submission is a declaration not only of the Philippine maritime entitlements under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but also the country's commitment to the responsible application of its processes. The Philippines underscored the significance of the submission in securing Philippine sovereign rights and maritime jurisdiction in the West Philippine Sea. It noted that the 2016 award on the South China Sea arbitration confirmed the Philippine maritime entitlements and rejected those that exceeded geographic and substantive limits under UNCLOS. The undersea region, where the Philippines seeks to formally establish its sovereign rights under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, covers the Spratlys, a chain of islands, reefs, and atolls that has been fiercely contested over the years by China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. The Philippines' undersea continental shelf could potentially overlap with those of other coastal states in the South China Sea, including that of Vietnam. Philippine officials expressed readiness to hold talks to resolve such issues based on UNCLOS. The Philippines makes this partial submission to build confidence and promote international cooperation in the peaceful and amicable resolution of maritime boundary issues. They clarified that its submission was filed without prejudice to similar entitlements in the region by Vietnam and Malaysia, which also filed claims before the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf that may overlap with the West Palawan region. The Philippines manifests its willingness to discuss with the relevant states the delimitation of maritime boundaries. In a bold move, the Philippines has asked the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf to review its claim for an extended continental shelf in the West Palawan region. They've made it clear that this request should be considered without affecting the ongoing negotiations over maritime boundaries with neighboring countries. But the story doesn't stop there. Vietnam has also weighed in, expressing its readiness to discuss overlapping claims with the Philippines in the South China Sea. In a recent statement posted on the Vietnamese Foreign Ministry's website, spokesperson Pham Thu Hang reiterated Vietnam's sovereignty over the Hoang Sa and Truong Sa archipelagos, known in English as the Paracel and Spratly Islands. This statement from Vietnam underscores the continued tensions and competing claims in these disputed waters. As these countries navigate their complex relationships and territorial disputes, the international community watches closely, eager to see how these discussions might shape the future of the South China Sea. The continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, as contained in the aforementioned submission by the Philippines, has seriously infringed China's sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction in the South China Sea. In accordance with Article 5 of Annex 1 to the Rules of Procedure of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, the Chinese government seriously requests the Commission not to consider the submission by the Philippines in its newest filing on June 14 in New York. Before the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, the Philippines, on the basis of hydrographic, geological, geophysical, and tectonic data and information in the West Palawan region in the West Philippine Sea, pointed out the existence of a prolonged Palawan-Mindoro microcontinent, which is a distinct geological and geomorphological unit, which includes, among others, the Palawan mainland and Calinian Island group. This marks the second submission of the Philippines on an extended continental shelf entitlement. The first submission was in 2009 related to the Philippine Rise, then called Benham, an area near the province of Aurora that's bigger than Luzon. In 2012, the UN body confirmed that it is part of the Philippine continental shelf and territory. Maritime law expert and retired Supreme Court Senior Associate Justice Antonio Carpio has advised the Philippine government to accept the standing invitation of Vietnam and Malaysia to submit their overlapping extended continental shelf claims in the southern area of the South China Sea to voluntary arbitration under UNCLOS. The Philippines should invite China to join in the voluntary arbitration if China believes it has a claim over the same area. This will ensure a peaceful settlement of the maritime dispute in accordance with the UN Charter and UNCLOS. Philippine Permanent Representative to the UN Antonio Lagdamio said the move can reinvigorate efforts of states to demonstrate their readiness to pursue the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS processes in the determination of maritime entitlements and promote a rules-based international order. Incidents in the waters tend to overshadow the importance of what lies beneath. The seabed and subsoil, extending from the Philippine archipelago up to the maximum extent allowed by UNCLOS, hold significant potential resources that will benefit the nation and its people for generations to come. Hostilities and tensions in the disputed waters have alarmingly escalated, particularly between China and the Philippines over two disputed shoals since last year. Chinese Coast Guard ships and suspected militia vessels have used powerful water cannons and dangerous blocking maneuvers against Philippine Coast Guard patrol ships and Navy boats, injuring Filipino personnel, damaging their supply boats, and straining diplomatic relations between the two countries. In response to the brutal act of the Chinese Coast Guard on June 17, President Marcos said the Philippines won't be intimidated but won't start a war with China.
We are not in the business to instigate wars. Our great ambition is to provide a peaceful and prosperous life for every Filipino. This is the drumbeat. This is the principle that we live by and that we march by.
In the wake of a violent clash with China, the Philippines stands firm in its commitment to a peaceful resolution, even as it refuses to be intimidated. Weeks back, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. addressed the nation during a visit to the Philippine Western Command headquarters on Palawan Island, reaffirming the country's dedication to resolving disputes through diplomacy while upholding its national integrity. The clash occurred near Second Thomas Shoal, a remote outpost about 120 miles from Palawan and over 600 miles from China's nearest major landmass. In a dramatic escalation of tensions, Chinese forces engaged Filipino Navy personnel with machetes, axes, and hammers, damaging at least 2 military boats in the process. This confrontation marks the most severe incident in a series of recent standoffs between Chinese and Philippine ships as Beijing intensifies its efforts to assert control over nearly the entire South China Sea. The international community quickly took notice, with strong condemnations coming from the United States, the European Union, Japan, Australia, and other Western and Asian nations. The clash has stoked fears that the U.S., bound by a mutual defense pact with the Philippines, could be drawn into the dispute. Amidst this tense backdrop, the Philippine government made it clear that while it did not view last week's incident as an armed attack warranting U.S. intervention, there remains significant concern about the possibility of future Chinese aggression aimed at dislodging the small Philippine military garrison stationed at Second Thomas Shoal. In a recent televised news conference, President Marcos' key advisors addressed the speculation that Manila might invoke the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty to seek U.S. military support. They reassured the public that while the confrontation was serious, the Philippines has no immediate plans to activate the treaty. This statement came in response to the incident where the Chinese Coast Guard not only rammed and boarded Philippine Navy boats, but also seized rifles from the Filipino personnel stationed at the shoal. As the situation unfolds, the Philippines remains steadfast in its pursuit of a peaceful resolution, staying true to its Filipino values while navigating the complex and fraught waters of international diplomacy. The Philippine military chief condemned the incident, likening it to an act of piracy, and demanded that China return the rifles and pay for the damage.
They got our equipment. We are demanding that the Chinese return our rifles and our equipment. No? And we are also demanding from them to pay for the damages that they have caused. No?
The territorial disputes involving China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan have long been seen as an Asian flashpoint that could pit the U.S. against China if high-seas confrontations escalate into armed conflict. Washington has repeatedly warned that it is obligated to help defend the Philippines, its oldest treaty ally in Asia, if Filipino forces, ships, and aircraft come under armed attack, including in the South China Sea. Professor J. Betombuckle, who teaches at the University of the Philippines, emphasized the distinction between an unlawful act and an act of war in international law. Not every unlawful act of a state is necessarily an act of war and formal hostilities between states. In international law, there are rules and jurisprudence on this issue, particularly international humanitarian law and laws of armed conflict. Amid rising tensions between the Philippines and China, It is noted that the country's constitutional mandate renounces war as national policy. The Philippines' first recourse would always be to seek a peaceful diplomatic solution. That's why it is not easy for the Philippines to simply react to every incident as if it is an act of war and warrants wholesale hostility. Executive Secretary Lucas Persamin said the government did not consider the Chinese Coast Guard confrontation an armed attack as stated in the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States, which critics may see as a concession to China. Persamin also said President Marcos approved a recommendation for the government to publicize the schedule when Navy personnel are deployed to transport food, water, and other supplies to the Philippines' territorial outpost in the shoal. A small Philippine Navy contingent aboard a long-grounded dilapidated warship, the Burpe Sierra Madre, has occupied 2nd Thomas Shoal since 1999, but China later deployed Coast Guard, Tele Navy, and suspected militia ships in a territorial standoff that has become increasingly volatile. Let me know what your take is on all of this, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates.